Today, we're here to listen to Dr. Andrew Weaver. When we first started doing research on the skills gap, one of the things that we quickly came across was the lack of good data on the types of skills that firms really needed in specific occupations. And so when I came across Andrew's work, I was delighted to see really high quality, rigorous, and finely grained data on these points. And so this is going to be one of the things that Andrew talks about today. Dr. Weaver is an assistant professor in the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has his PhD from the MIT Sloan School of Management, and before academia, he was a vice president at NCB Capital Impact, and so he has extensive experience in industry as well as doing research on the labor market and employment. So can you please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Weaver?
My talk is going to be on whether or not we see signs of a skill gap in a fast-growing technical occupation in the IT field. So what's the issue here? We have a lot of complaints from firms and organizations that they can't access the skilled workers they need. And these claims persist really through the kind of ups and the downs of the business cycle. And this leads a lot of people to say that there's a structural problem, and in particular to make a lot of assertions about inadequate STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics skills in the workforce. There's some past research, including some of my own, that casts a bit of doubt on some of these stories, but there are still folks who say, look, you know, this may not characterize the entire labor market, but it may be an emerging problem in corners of the market or something that is going to happen soon. So ultimately, we're going to focus on this question of, is there some kind of gap between the supply and demand of skills in the market? And specifically, when we very precisely measure hiring difficulties and skill demands, do we see a gap in critical, fast-growing occupations that might indicate there's some type of problem coming as technology spreads further through the economy? There have been a lot of assertions about skills made by, policymakers, or politicians, made by, representatives of international organizations, the media, representatives of the Federal Reserve. These are very widespread kind of assertions that we face a real problem about inadequate skills and a kind of gap between employer demands and workforce supplies. And the way this debate gets framed in kind of the public discussion rests on two central assertions. One is that this is a supply side problem, supply side of the labor market being workers supplying skills, and the problem lies that workers just don't have enough skills, they haven't made enough investments in skills, and educational institutions that are responsible for training aren't performing up to speed. And the second assertion that's very common is that the issue relates particularly to technology. These kind of STEM skills are really driving the situation. Sometimes you hear some complaints about newer soft skills, but a heavy focus on the role of science and technology. Simple versions of things like skill-biased technical change, technological change increases demand for computer-related skills, and workers ultimately lack these skills. Due to the framing, this particular framing that kind of guides the debate, a number of factors get left out of the analysis and discussion. And these include things like organizational characteristics, management strategy, local, environmental, factors related to the economic environment, and institutions. So we're going to try to add back some of these. By the way, how late are we going here? Remind me.
About an hour.
Oh, okay, about an hour.
You can go over that. You can go over that if you need to.
Okay. So just stop me if if we go too long. I can go on for a long time. So This is a very relevant topic. Ultimately, policymakers need to understand this, both to foster economic growth and to improve worker outcomes. And if the problem is a, kind of long-term structural one, there's not a lot we can do in the near term. We can kind of exhort younger cohorts to get more education and wait 10 or 20 years and see if everything works out. But if it turns out that other factors, some of the things I just mentioned, are important in improving hiring outcomes, it opens the door for a lot of additional policy interventions, things like improving the quality of labor market intermediaries or getting firms to adopt best practice HR practices. These types of things, become relevant again. So we will test whether that's, whether that's the case and whether we need to look at this wider range of options. So this is an important topic. Why haven't we already nailed this down? Why are there still open or outstanding questions? Generally is due to lack of detailed data on this topic. A lot of the debate has been dominated by kind of non-representative trade association surveys. Academic research on this tends to use very general aggregate data without direct measurement of critical items like skills or hiring outcomes at the establishment level, the kind of business work location level. In the past, there have been two kind of main approaches that the academic literature has taken to try and figure out whether there's some kind of persistent gap or hiring friction in the market. The first one I call the quantity method, where you actually go and try and estimate what's the supply of skills in the market, what's the demand of skills in the market, subtract one from another, and call the difference a surplus or a gap. The problem with this kind of quantity method is we don't actually have measures of skills. So people tend to use proxies like education, but then they often end up using educational attainment as a proxy on both the supply side of the market and the demand side of the market. So it gets very unclear what is actually being measured. An additional issue that arises with this kind of quantity method, it's very sensitive to small changes in assumptions. So if you end up assuming that the college attainment rate over the next 15 years is going to increase by another, 1/10 of a percentage point, these things end up making a big difference. And suddenly, a huge gap turns into a huge surplus, and you don't have a lot of confidence that you're really kind of getting at the situation. The other way to go, and I end up using a version of this, is what I call the indicator method, where we say, all right, we can't necessarily figure out exactly what the supply and demand are, but we can look for signs of the friction. And so the idea here is you either use wages or vacancies as job vacancies as a sign that there's some kind of friction in the market and supply and demand aren't kind of smoothly equilibrating. There are a number of drawbacks, though, to the way that this is typically done. It's always sensible to take a look at wages as a first step analysis. To the extent that demand exceeds supply for a particular set of skills, we would expect wages to rise for those skills. But there's a lot of reasons why wages can rise that don't relate to fundamental kind of textbook economics. There are things like inter-industry wage differentials. There's the fact that as the economy kind of opens up to globalization, this can put kind of price ceilings on tradable goods. There's a lot of reasons why you could have some type of structural problem and not see it show up one for one in wages. Vacancy unemployment analyses, are at some level even more common. The issue, with most of these kind of beverage curve analysis, these things are actually conditional on the level of aggregate demand in the economy, so you're not necessarily picking up kind of a structural condition. And ultimately, you don't see what kind of mechanisms are operating below. These things are using national vacancies and national unemployment rates. We're not down at the level of the business establishment. And so it's a bit like, you know, the view from 35,000 feet out of an airplane window. It's worth conducting the exercise. It's interesting to know what kind of results you get out of that, but you don't really know what's going on below the clouds. So this kind of leads to my approach, where I'd argue that to really make progress, you know, and answer questions about skill and mismatch, it's really important to gather direct evidence on the topic. You know, what skills do employers demand, and do, you know, establishments that demand high levels of skills have trouble hiring workers? To really narrow in on skills, it's also important to focus on particular industries and occupations. So we know we're talking apples to apples. And it's important to add these factors I mentioned earlier, kind of organizations, strategy, institutions, market conditions back into the analysis. So we're not just predetermining that all of our analysis and any solutions we end up proposing are all going to relate to the quality of labor supply, because that's the only thing we looked at. We want to look at these other factors to see if they're important too. All right, so this provides the rationale for a larger research project I've been doing for the past few years. I've conducted 3 national surveys on particular industries and occupations, one in manufacturing with production workers, the IT one I'm going to talk about today, and there's another lab tech one that is, you know, still in, even newer, still in a little bit of process. The goals today for this presentation are set boundaries on the incidence of skill gaps. How big a problem or small a problem is this across all of you know, the kind of IT help desk occupation and industry? And then to measure what characteristics predict hiring problems. To the extent there are some hiring problems, what's associated with that? Is it skill demands? Is it other stories? Does it relate to technology? Does it relate to some of these other organizational strategy and you know, market position factors and the characteristics of the local environment? So why look at IT help desk workers? What's you know, what's particularly interesting about this occupation? The typical argument in the U.S. that you hear a lot is that, you know, workers lack sufficient STEM skills. And this is often combined with kind of a broad critique of the public education system, you know, that it's not doing its job. If we were to look at, say, a shortage of PhD, you know, computer research scientists, it's not really a great test of that claim. If the problem America faces is that instead of producing, you know, 200 PhD computer research scientists a year, we should produce 300. You know, that may be, but at some level that's a solvable problem, and that doesn't necessarily kind of, it's not implicated in some indictment of the Detroit public school system. This is kind of a rarefied, you know, occupation in a corner of the industry. Ultimately, we want an occupation that employs a lot of workers, is in a technical field, has some real technology-driven skill demands, and one that would potentially be accessible to a broad swath of workers if they modestly upgraded their computer math or other technical skills. So, you know, that combination of things is going to let us test a number of these ideas in a much more policy-relevant setting. And it turns out, that, you know, there's a Fed analysis that actually selected IT help desk workers as one of the nation's principal opportunity occupations, in that it has above median wages and at the same time has a fair number of workers who have less than a 4-year college degree. So it provides a good setting to kind of dig into serious skill demands, but big occupation that employs a lot of workers. Okay. So what's this occupation? I think most of you are familiar. IT help desk workers are individuals who handle service tickets and you know, issues related to computer problems. They also implement IT-related projects about upgrading and things like this. There are different tiers. You know, Tier 1 help desk workers might be dealing with more things like password resets. Tier 2 workers have more ability to get at root causes of problems, and tier 3 workers are going to have particular application specialties. This might be somebody who has a lot of, is an expert with Oracle data warehouses and is able to, work through some particular problems around a very focused topic. There are about 600,000 of these. Turns out this is the second largest computer/mathematical occupation in the country after application developer. About just less than 30% of these folks have a 4-year degree, so there's some real heterogeneity within the occupation. There's a higher level category called computer network support specialists that sometimes gets wrapped into this in government statistics. I focus on the technician level, computer user support specialist level, but as you'll see when I present some of the validation information, there is this higher category that appears in some of the statistics. And unlike, say, manufacturing production worker, my earlier survey, this occupation is projected to grow at, roughly twice the rate of average occupations across America through, 2024. So this is an occupation that at least the BLS is projecting to have some significant growth. And there are a lot of different names for these people. Service desk technicians, help desk technicians, IT support technicians. There are a lot of different common ways of referring to these folks. So to set the stage, it's pretty easy to find industry claims saying, 40, 50, 60% of help desks have problems accessing some, level of technician that they're really seeking. But when we take a look at wages, again, a good first step, the orange line there is employment and the blue line is wages. There are some issues about, with the BLS and the way they track and aggregate the occupation that, get a little complex. But the general takeaway is there's been an upward, this has been an increasing occupation in terms of employment over the past, 16, 17 years. We don't see, in terms of real wages, sustained kind of increase in real wages. There's a little tiny bit trend up at the last few years, but overall, if anything, we see a slight decrease. So this, whenever we have different competing claims, people say there's a problem and other data that indicates there might be less of a problem, it's always worth digging in and kind of gathering some very direct data on the ground with as precise measurement as we can. And so that's what we're going to do. So the IT Help Desk Skills Survey, this was administered mainly in 2015, a little bit bled over into 2016. One key thing, it's based on a random sample of business establishments from the Dun & Bradstreet database. This distinguishes it from a lot of trade association surveys based on, say, non-random membership lists. I do oversample some key industries that are the largest employers of IT help desk workers. These are very labor-intensive surveys. They involve having survey research team place thousands of phone calls to IT help desk, identifying particular IT help desk managers, mailing the surveys to them with a $10 bill attached to each one, placing lots of follow-up phone calls and postcards and emails. Ultimately had a total kind of sample size a little over 400 for a 27% response rate. For those of you familiar with typical mailed social science surveys to business establishments, the kind of average response rates are more in the single digits. So this is kind of 4 or 5 times what what a lot of surveys get. It's a little bit lower than in my manufacturing survey. I got a 36% response rate using similar methods. Turns out it is harder because of the way IT help desks are embedded within larger organizations. Getting to the manager as opposed to a technician of those IT help desks is more challenging than getting hold of a plant manager in a manufacturing firm, I now know. So It's a little bit lower, but still, a much kind of better than average response rate. In terms of survey design, people answer about the survey based on whatever the largest tier of help desk workers they employ is. And what really distinguishes the questions of the survey, I try to avoid opinion questions, do you have a problem with, hiring, and focus more specifically on, what skills do you need for this job? Do you need to know, algebra, geometry, Apple operating systems, networking, cloud-based or virtual desktop processes. I ask kind of a battery of very concrete and specific skills, questions about skill demands. And then I operationalize the concept of a skill gap as a vacancy, a prolonged vacancy that has lasted 3 months or more. And the idea here is that some positive level of vacancies is needed for the smooth operation of the labor market. But if those vacancies persist over time, it's a potentially troubling sign that businesses just can't access the, the skills and the skilled workforce that they need to grow. In addition to that, I collect a lot of other data on organizational characteristics and characteristics of the workforce and some elements of the local environment. And I have the locations of all of these things so I can link in other data as well. All right, so validation. This is also a step that you often don't see with with a lot of kind of survey data that tries to get at some of these more fine-grained questions. I compared the IT help desk survey with the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Employment Survey and with the Census Bureau's American Community Survey. We expect the American Community Survey in particular to be a little different from the figures I got for 2 reasons, really. One, the occupation they're measuring includes that higher category of computer network support specialists. So their numbers should have a few more higher educated folks. But ultimately, we should be in the same ballpark if I have nationally representative numbers here. The OES is the same. They have the same kind of population I have. They have a focus just on the computer user support specialists, so they're more comparable, but they don't ask questions about a lot of the other characteristics we'd like to compare benchmark numbers on. So you can see here, hourly wages, I'm pretty close to, no significant difference from a statistical standpoint to the OES, computer user support specialists, about, $24, $25 an hour. In terms of median wages, I'm very close, $23 versus $23.38 per hour. So wages appear to be capturing, average wages appear to be capturing the dynamics that, that are going on in the OES survey. I should also say, in making comparisons with the ACS survey, the second reason why we would expect their numbers to vary a little is that's an individual-based survey, and I'm doing business establishments and getting the managers averaging of their workforce characteristics. That being said, percent female, very similar. Younger workers, age 30 or less, very similar. To the extent there's a difference between my numbers and the ACS numbers, I have more high school only educated workers. Again, what would be expected given that they include a higher educated category in their computer support specialist occupation. And you can see, even with that, in terms of, say, 4-year college graduates, I'm pretty close. They're have slightly more, again, to be expected. So on the whole, this survey does appear to kind of faithfully capture what you find when you look at nationally representative figures for some common benchmark demographic categories of this occupation. I also do a response bias analysis. Are there certain types of help desks or regions or industries that are more or less likely to respond? The basic takeaway from this is computer systems design firms are somewhat less likely to respond. Schools and universities are somewhat more likely to respond. When I put together descriptive statistics, I use weights to adjust for these differential responses. So this is just briefly to give you a flavor of some. These are, the next few pages are just a few of the kind of mini skills I asked about, but it gives you a sense of what some of the skill demands are in this industry. Things like basic math, very widely demanded, close to 80% require, everything from addition and subtraction up through fractions, decimals, and percentages for their IT help desk technicians. However, once we get to higher level math, which I call extended math, which involves any one of, algebra, geometry, probability statistics up through calculus and, more advanced mathematical disciplines, only about a third of help desks require that. So, it's a non-trivial, percentage that do require these higher level math demands, but it's not something that characterizes the majority of IT help desks. And higher level reading scores is again, or requirements is again a characteristic or a skill demand that about half of establishments require, say, reading articles in trade journals about your discipline to get information on a particular topic. So one takeaway from this, and we could say complex technical writing is something, around half, a little over half of IT help desks kind of place a very high importance on that skill. One takeaway from this is there's a lot of heterogeneity within the occupation, and one thing to be careful of, these days a ton of skill-based research uses ONET data. ONET gives you one value for the entire nation for a particular occupation, or two values if you want to separate out, kind of the importance scores and what have you. These numbers show there are a lot of, within any given occupation, there's just a lot of, intra-occupational heterogeneity. You can't necessarily characterize skill demands for an entire occupation with one set of numbers. So it's something to be careful of. In terms of computer skills, networking skills, super widely demanded in this occupation. Performing client services and project-based work, again, pretty widely demanded. When we get down to things like cloud-based or virtual desktop processes, these are a little more cutting-edge skills. About 2/3 require these. And when you look at kind of how many require high levels or do high proportions of this work, the numbers fall further. And interestingly, computer programming, we often hear people say, generically, this is the solution, when workers lack skills, go learn some kind of computer programming. Turns out that a little less than 15% of U.S. help desks require computer programming for their IT help desk technicians. Again, this is the second largest computer occupation in the country. So this just points out that, having the knowledge about what employers actually need is not widespread, and we have to be a little cautious about generic recommendations to just go learn some particular skill. Employers often need packages of skills that are not completely obvious to lots of people, including labor economists, and this is the only source of this data in the country, and these surveys are not done every year. So this does kind of give us a sense that it's important to have a lot of employer integration when designing particular skill programs, because staying on top of all this stuff is hard. Okay, and soft skills, things like cooperation, very widely demanded, high levels of cooperation. Ability to solve unfamiliar problems, we see a somewhat lower, but still pretty wide level of demand. When we get down to some soft skills that relate to kind of autonomy and initiative, critically evaluating different options, about 61% require this. Ability to initiate new tasks without guidance from management, this kind of initiative autonomy skill, about half of IT help desks require this have structured their jobs so that this is a very important feature. So we have kind of a range of different demands associated with different soft skills. All right, what does the hiring funnel look like for these folks? Typically, IT help desk get about 25 on average applicants per position, median of 15. They take, depending on whether we look at the mean or the median, they interview 5 or 6 candidates. They take 4 to 7 weeks to make an offer, and somewhere in the 86 to 95% of candidates accept the offer. So that's the general process. And now we can take a look at what is the incidence of signs of skill gaps. The way to read this is the orange bar, or dark reddish looking bar there on the left, is telling you that 85% of U.S. help desks do not have any long-term vacancies, these kind of signs of extended hiring frictions that we think might point to a potential skill gap. At the other end of the spectrum, about 11% of IT help desks have a level of long-term vacancies that rises to 10% or more of their total help desk workforce. So, which is arguably a potentially troubling sign of some kind of friction. We don't yet know it's skills that are causing that, but in general, this puts kind of a boundary on what's the potential size of this problem. It doesn't appear to be something that characterizes 90% of the industry, really kind of 11 to 15% of the industry here in this occupation appears to have some kind of frictions that deserve some further explanation. And this is just a brief comparison with the other industries. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly, but the purple bar is manufacturing. If anything, given that IT is a more educated, educational requirements are higher, pay is higher, and the survey was done later, a few years later in a tighter labor market, we would expect the purple bar to be higher than the red bar. We would expect manufacturing to have had, more signs of hiring frictions. Here, IT help desk workers have, the largest number of establishments that have no signs of these frictions, more than even manufacturing. So this again starts to make us think about reframing the discussion over some of these issues. So now we can move into the question, well, if, so maybe we have some frictions in a portion of the industry. If you demand high skills, are you going to be part of that 11 to 15%? What predicts the hiring frictions we do see? We're going to run an analysis with a dependent variable is an indicator for long-term vacancies. I'm going to use a heteroscedasticity corrected logit model. I'll skip over the econometric details, but as some of you may know, the heteroscedasticity is a much bigger issue for nonlinear models because parameter estimates can be inconsistent. So here I correct for that. We have a number of reduced forms, supply and demand controls, control for employment level, wage differentials between the establishment average wage and the county average wage for this occupation. And our key right-hand side variables are skill variables, and then a number of proxies for different stories, mechanisms about kind of different packages of variables. They're associated with stories that go beyond skills about how we could end up with frictions or hiring difficulties. So that's what we're estimating. And some of these, again, right-hand side variables, we test for STEM skills. We've got, math and programming. I use a help desk index that kind of, sums how many different help desk skills a particular establishment, demands. I've individually tested all of these help desk skills as well. I don't show you every specification. Soft skills, we've got a number of cooperation, unfamiliar problems, and initiative. And then in terms of these alternative mechanisms, the package one kind of says, hey, is this about levels of technology? We have indicator for above average technology, indicator for does this institution do a high proportion of cutting edge work as measured by the proportion of cloud and virtual desktop work it does. Does it engage in frequent product innovation, kind of designing new client services? Does it engage in frequent process innovation, kind of redesigning its work process? The second package relates to internal work organizations. Is it the case that things the firm does, strategic choices and job design and other things make a difference? We have an indicator for high discretion job design. Does the establishment provide formal training? And does it use an ITIL or lean formal management system? This is kind of like an ISO 9000 management system for help desks. And so the idea is there any difference for help desks that use this kind of very formal management process? Package 3 is external factors, or factors external to the establishment making a difference here. We control for county unemployment rate, demand increase over the past 5 years. Is the establishment part of an occupational cluster, where there are many similar employers or similar technicians clustered in an area? Is it a function of how dense are the available computer and math workers in the area? If I have the location quotient for the density of that occupation in a given county. And finally, I have a measure of, does industry constraint matter? So this particularly measures what degree of monopoly firms do, or the industry that this help desk is embedded within does or does not have. If an establishment shows is in an industry where there is very little, the top 4 firms control very little of the aggregate revenues of the industry, I end up labeling that as a constrained environment. They don't have access to monopoly rents. For schools and universities, that is your county's educational budget in the bottom quartile. But the general idea with this is you're facing a constrained situation where you don't have protection from competition, you don't have access to monopoly rents, you don't have kind of richer budgets to fall back on. Okay, so what are our results here? Turns out that higher level reading demands are very predictive of greater hiring challenges. If you demand higher level reading, you are 9 or 10 percentage points. You have a 9 or 10 percentage point higher probability of experiencing a long-term vacancy than a help desk that doesn't demand high-level reading skills. This result, interestingly, is very consistent with my findings in manufacturing. That was a big surprise of the manufacturing study, that high-level reading skills ended up being as or more predictive as any other skill of hiring difficulty. So this, again, shifts our attention a little away from just a pure STEM skill focus and says, there's a wider range of skills that are relevant for a lot of occupations, even in a very technical field. Cooperation with other employees. Turns out if the establishment has designed the job placing a very high importance on cooperation, that is associated with a pretty large and significant reduction in the probability of showing signs of hiring frictions. As I'll talk about a little more, this may be related to some kind of job design effect. Couple soft problem-solving, initiative, autonomy skills, ability to solve unfamiliar problems, and ability to initiate new tasks without guidance from management. These are both predictive of greater levels of hiring difficulty. So a couple, and I find this result to be actually somewhat similar to Matthew's findings, in Beyond the Skills Gap. This kind of problem-solving, critical, kind of critical initiative type skills end up being important. And I should say these two columns, the column on the left is a full model without industry fixed effects, but includes the industry constraint variable. The model on the right includes industry fixed effects without the industry constraint variable, which is collinear. So that's kind of gives you two flavors of the full model. Technical skills, in some specifications, and I've shown one here, computer programming is predictive, demands for computer programming is predictive of greater levels of hiring difficulty. In most specifications, it turns out it's not. That is not a super robust finding. Interestingly, more robust than that is the broader range of help desk skills. The more, kind of different help desk skills that an establishment demands for its help desk technicians, the less likely it is to have a hiring problem. And this again may relate to designing the job, in some manner to use a broad range of skills. Could invite more applicants, but one takeaway from this is there's not a consistent prediction of greater level hiring problems from a whole slew of different technical skills, and when these technical skills are entered individually, none of them positively kind of predict greater hiring difficulties. Okay. So what about these packages? If we look at the technology indicators, establishments that have a high proportion of kind of cutting edge cloud virtual work turns out have significantly lower levels of hiring problems. And establishments that engage in frequent product innovation have significantly, it's hard to see on here, but those are negative, negatives in front of the 0.107 and 0.111. They have 10 to 11 percentage points lower likelihood of experiencing long-term vacancies and persistent hiring difficulties if they engage in frequent product innovation. And we can talk about that, but again, one of the pictures that's emerging here is if you can fall, if you've got this could imply that the organization is more sophisticated, and more sophisticated organizations that engage in this type of organization, maybe they're better at HR and recruiting. Could imply that something about job design, again, that jobs that are designed in kind of a more kind of less static manner are more appealing to applicants. There's a number of different stories. It could imply shielding from competition by engaging in this frequent innovation. In terms of the internal work organization designs, it turns out that high discretion job design is associated with significantly lower levels of hiring difficulty. Again, this could make the job more appealing to applicants. Job design, appears to make some difference. And a couple of, results that are less intuitive. One is using in one of these formal management systems is associated with significantly more hiring problems. And this is a very robust result that holds across, many different specifications. I'll talk a little more about it in a second. Also, being part of an occupational cluster where there are many employers of similar type help desk technicians clustered in an area is also associated with significantly greater hiring difficulties. That is a very similar result. I basically found industry clusters in the manufacturing case were big predictors of greater levels of hiring difficulty. And I'll dig into that in just a second. And industry constraint, having this constrained position where you don't have access to monopoly profits and you're potentially more exposed to competitive features without being able to fall back on big county budgets in an educational context, or monopoly industry practices and monopoly rents in a private sector context, that turns out to predict greater levels of hiring difficulty. Okay, and that's just the end of that. So because only 22% of the sample use these formal management systems, the ITIL or lean management or other similar systems, it's too small in a nonlinear model with this sample size to do extensive interaction analysis. But we can look at the descriptive statistic and just ask the question, who are these these kind of formal management system help desk? What characterizes their operations? First thing we notice is in terms of volume per worker, number of clients served per worker. They are serving a lot more clients per worker. Over 1,600 people per worker are being supported by a single technician versus an average of 603 across the entire sample. They don't show signs of higher levels of technology or higher proportions of cutting-edge work than other establishments, but they do have a really different structure to their workforce. They make much heavier use of the lower skilled tier 1 help desk technicians and significantly less use of the more skilled tier 3 help desk workers. And finally, they're much more likely to use monitoring of calls, listening in on calls, as a method of trying to kind of raise productivity. So we can't say anything definitive because, again, I would need a much larger sample size to kind of, test for nonlinear interactions and all these things. But this does kind of give us a sense that these are help desks that are, kind of squeezing a lot of work out of, the lower skilled employees. By the way, the wage information up there is showing on average they do not pay higher wages. So they're kind of at some level substituting these management systems for skill rather than having these management systems complement skill, which is often our idea when we think about high performance work systems and some of these lean systems. That doesn't really seem to be happening here. But nevertheless, the story that emerges out of this is not one where the formal management systems are kind of a veil for technological, factors and a STEM skill story or something like that. Because cluster establishments that are part of, occupational clusters make up about 50% of the sample. It's just large enough we can tentatively run a few models where we include interaction effects. Again, got to be cautious because with this sample size and a nonlinear model, your cell sizes start to get pretty small. But we can at least get a tentative sense by to the model on the left from a few pages ago, adding in some interaction effects. And this is what we find. First, being part of an occupational cluster and demanding computer programming does not make you more likely to experience hiring difficulties. In fact, it makes you insignificantly less likely. So it doesn't seem that occupational cluster is picking up some more sophisticated high-end skill demands due to some kind of industry cluster effect or occupational cluster effect. What is significant in terms of interaction effects, if you are part of an industry cluster and you are in a very constrained position in an industry with low levels of monopoly, low access to monopoly rents or constrained budgets, you're 20 percentage points more likely to have a hiring problem. So this, again, kind of pushes a little of this idea, this this occupational cluster, there may be a lot of competition for workers, but if you are in a very exposed position in the middle of that competitive situation where you don't have access to something to shield yourself from that competition, some monopoly rents or what have you, you're more likely to have some difficulties. On the flip side, if you are part of an occupational cluster and you engage in frequent product innovation, frequent redesign of client services, you're 18 percentage points or 19 percentage points less likely to have a hiring problem. So again, you could tell a number of different stories here, but what appears to matter here is kind of market position. It's shifting our attention away from, workers just didn't study enough math skills, and more towards where is the particular industry and establishment located competitively in its regional market environment. Okay, so to summarize these results, most computer and math skill demands are not associated with greater hiring problems. Higher levels of technology are not associated with greater long-term vacancies. Help desks with a high proportion of cutting-edge work or frequent product innovation actually have lower levels of difficulties. You know, there are some of these soft autonomy, problem-solving skills that are predictive of hiring difficulties. These things appear to be important and not necessarily easy to find for some help desks. Higher level reading skills, are very, and in specifications I didn't show, it turns out higher level writing skills are also sometimes predictive of greater hiring difficulties. High discretion job design and high cooperation requirements are both associated with lower hiring problems. You know, this could be a story about making the occupation more attractive to applicants if you have, a well-designed job versus one that, has a heavy monitoring and is less attractive. Or it could be a sign that the organizations that engage in this kind of job design and high cooperation structure to the occupation have more sophisticated operations. They're better at recruiting, or they're better at somehow, filling their vacancies. Could be either. Use of formal management systems is linked to more hiring difficulties, but as we've seen, the fact that these folks make such, heavier use of the lower skilled tier of workers kind of makes us doubt this is really a skill-driven issue. Constrained industries have more difficulties. Occupational clusters, as we just talked about, are associated with greater difficulties. So, this implies that there's really no widespread skill gap problem in this industry. And conventional stories about technology and STEM skills and hiring problems, at least in this cross-sectional data, which has much greater precision around these topics than than kind of surveys that have come before it or research that has come before it, don't really match the data here. This does not mean that skills are not important. I always have to say this. Skills are very important. There are skills that do predict greater hiring difficulties. Everything from some soft skills, occasionally computer programming, higher level reading skills. Skills are, critical for, raising productivity and what have you. But ultimately, we need a more balanced approach than this conventional STEM skill, skill-biased technical change account that kind of places all blame on the supply side of the market. We really need to add into the analysis factors like job design, organizational strategy, market characteristics, the nature of institutions. These things matter, what market position you have. We need to add those in both to our analysis of the problem, and frankly, any proposed solutions need to, make use of that analysis and involve these factors. And with that, take any questions you got.
You had mentioned on one of your slides the indicators of employees needing soft skills, empathy skills, those kinds of things. Were you able to take a look at any kind of resumes or cover letters where a potential candidate would indicate that they have those skills? Was there something in general that a potential candidate would put on their resume to indicate that they have those preferred skills?
No, so these surveys are, of IT help desk managers who are typically the hiring managers. And so it's kind of saying what skills do you require for your help desk technicians? It's not focusing on kind of particular workers. The IT help desk managers basically saying, my IT help desk, yes, I require this skill, no, I don't require this skill, and that's what's driving the data you see here.
It would be interesting to see how people are indicating they have those skills when they apply.
Yeah. So, I think, if I could have both the employer side and a full survey of job applicants, that would be even really interesting. It does get at the idea, though, by looking at these persistent vacancies, you are picking up where there are frictions in hiring and what's associated with with those frictions. One other element, and I know, Peter Capelli's name has come up. There was a theory about computer screening of applicants, and that computers might be screening out lots of resumes when people submit them. This is one of the first kind of nationally representative surveys. I know that I actually stuck in a question about, do you use automatic computer screening of applicants to see? Turns out about 16% of IT help desks use automatic screening, and when you throw it in as a predictor of hiring frictions, it doesn't have a significant effect. So I'm not saying that could become a big issue in the future. I would say IT help desks probably make more use of this than, say, manufacturing firms or what have you. At this point, it hasn't grown to be a big enough phenomenon that it's showing up statistically. But so that's probably the most I have on like the interface of people applying and what might be happening.
Do you think that just the fact that soft skills are harder to have like an objective measure or indicator of could be another reason for that? Like like reading and math level or something like that. You can have courses as an objective measure or some other. You could give an assessment and you can kind of. It's harder for an employer to use this as a kind of a make or break criteria. Do you think that soft skills have that? I mean, we had a speaker come and talk about badging, so there's been some effort to like create these like objective looking measures of soft skills, but do you think that might be another reason?
There are two potential issues that arise out of this. One is on the employer side. Are employers not able to use soft skills to kind of screen, because it's hard to kind of figure out when an employee is applying, what level of, cooperation do they have? Maybe it's easier to, give them a math test or something like that. The other issue is on the researcher side. It could be harder for me to pick up, the significant impact of certain soft skills just because it's harder to measure, and they could be having a bigger impact, but it's much harder to measure that than, do you need to know algebra, yes or no? So I do think that's an issue. I try to ask about a lot of different soft skills, and some of them are predictive. When you get to ones like, it depends on what you call soft skill, but ability to initiate new tasks without guidance and, solve unfamiliar problems and things like that, those are predictive of hiring problems. So it's not, certain soft kind of, non-pure hard skill demands are showing up in the data as predictive. One challenge with things like cooperation in the presence of a lot of other variables in a full model, kind of the conditional marginal effect, is showing up as a significant predictor of less problems. So there's some appeal, you're picking up both a skill demand effect, but you may be also, when I put that in there, I may also be picking up kind of a job design effect, that the establishments that have designed very high cooperation style technician positions appear to have lower hiring problems. So, and that may, be less about just meeting the skill than it's really attractive to have a job designed that way, and more people want to apply, and everybody says this is a great place to work or something. So, some of the soft skills may be picking up, more than just a pure skill design, skill demand, and are you over the hump or not? Yeah, it's an issue. Measuring soft skills is a big challenge, and I guess the final thing I'd say about that, for things like teamwork and cooperation, they're so widely demanded. Even if you say, is it very, very, very important? Well, everybody says it's very important. So it becomes hard to pick up gradations when, everybody kind of is saying teamwork or cooperation is super important. There's got to be some ultimate way to pick that up, but I haven't cracked the code on that.
I would say management style is a big factor, and I don't know exactly how you might be able to measure for that. I've worked in a call center, and there the most important thing tends to be metrics. And when the most important thing is metrics, customer satisfaction usually is lower. And then, of course, if you have a place where customer service is highly sought and rapport is, then maybe customer satisfaction is higher, but your metrics are lower. Because as you know, the more listening and talking you do, the fewer calls you'll complete during a day.
Right.
So is that something you were able to ask the supervisors, like which is more of value, how quickly the call or the service is completed, or how satisfied the customer is?
So I think that's a great question. I debated about trying to put in, some folks who've done call center research, like Rosemary Baddock at Cornell has done a lot, have put in kind of, time to resolution of the issue and some measures to try and get at productivity. I didn't end up doing it here, partially because this was already an 18, 19-page survey, but also the range of tasks. Not all help desk technicians are just doing trouble ticket work. Some of them are like doing project, system upgrades across an entire department, and so this kind of project-based work as opposed to client problem-based work. And so there wasn't one. It wasn't easy to figure out without making the survey a lot longer how to get a consistent measure of productivity. If you just said how many minutes on average does it take you to resolve this problem? If it was a department that was more focused on, upgrading systems and doing project-based work, they wouldn't show up well on that, but they're not really less productive. So I didn't get too far into that. I'm interested in I'd love to talk to you afterwards, since I've done a lot of field interviews, but not that many of the folks I've talked to have actually seen the results. I'd love to get some of your reactions, and in particular, I'd love to know on the ITIL management thing. When I presented those descriptive statistics, at some level, this is a little in line with what you're saying. The folks using these kind of formal management systems had much greater use of monitoring technology, listening in, as opposed to other management styles. And they were really, appeared to be kind of squeezing a lot of call volume out of, workers with these, more formal systems, more monitoring, not using the kind of highest skilled employee, but trying to take lower skilled employees and really crank them through a high volume. And so I think that part of it may be a little consistent with what you're saying, but I'd be interested in your view.
Lots of people preach ITIL, but most people don't employ it.
Okay.
Is what I found in the industry anyway, at least in academia.
Yeah.
I haven't worked in the corporate world for a while now, so I don't know what the current methods are. I do know that if you're just setting password resets out in the real world, it's all about call volume and get that phone completed. Right. That's why when you call Charter, it's just,
right away.
Not about customer service.
Yeah.
Sorry if there's a Charter employee in the room.
You didn't include wages as predicted. You did report.
I did. So what I include is I take the log difference between the average help desk wage at the particular establishment and the average help desk technician wage in the surrounding county. So I take the ratio of those two, the log of the ratio of those two, which is the same as the log difference, and that's so I'm controlling for, how basically wages are normalized by county, what county in America, and so the question is, how much above or below the average county help desk wage is your establishment? I'm controlling for that.
How do you know it's a hiring challenge instead of a retention challenge?
I have how many people, and I specifically only include terminations for establishments that have seen either stable demand or increasing demand. So these are more people getting fired, or not so much people getting laid off because the business is declining. These are, maybe it's a performance issue and the employee isn't doing a good job. I don't have specific reasons behind every single termination, but I try to kind of limit to that situations where that's more likely. The dynamics around terminations are different than the kind of hiring frictions and unfilled. One of the main questions I had about terminations and turnover was, could it be the case that some of these soft skills are hard to evaluate up front, so they don't end up being the make or break about let's hire this person, let's not hire, but firms end up making more mistakes on soft skills, and it could be the case that you hire people and then 4 months later you discover this person isn't a team player, or this person has no initiative, and then you have to fire them. And so the idea was, could I be missing a bunch of soft skill effects by just looking at hiring and not at terminations? In general, the answer to that was kind of no. Terminations, there was fewer kind of predictive factors were significant predictors of termination, which kind of tells me there's a lot of different stories about termination, and they don't kind of neatly follow one particular narrative. There's a tiny, that's only significant at the 10% level, math, demanding higher level math, it was associated with an additional, that's 2/3 of a person turnover. What was significant was wages. So it turns out if you pay above county wages, you are much less likely to have turnover. And that was a very robust and pretty large result. And then what else was significant was size of help desks. So it turns out small help desks, and I've known this from this is similar to the results I got in the manufacturing, they're a little less able to tolerate some of these vacancies. There was also a question about, do hiring problems for very small help desks show up differently? Do they have to fill the position because you can't leave it open for a long time, but then they end up firing more people? So it does kind of look like that. They are much more likely to have turnover in small help desks. It's not necessarily all skills, though. Remember, the fact that wages are so important. Small help desks also probably pay lower wages. The job quality isn't as good. There aren't as many internal advancement opportunities. So there's a lot of other stories about how small help desks could end up with greater turnover, even if it's not all skills. But so those factors appear to be important. Size of the help desk, maybe the job quality comes in there, the level of wages. But we don't see kind of a huge hidden soft skill effect or other thing when we look at terminations. The one other interesting thing, though, is frequent process innovation for help desks, not product innovation. Here we're redesigning work processes. That was associated with a significantly greater levels of turnover. And that does kind of point to perhaps some adaptation where the type of employees working in small help desks have a little more trouble, or the help desks have a little more trouble adapting to frequent changes in the workflow and the work processes. That was predictive. So again, it doesn't point to the problem is nobody knows computer programming. It kind of points to job design and adaptability and how big your organization is, and maybe some elements of job quality. Like those appear to be important predictors of terminations, but not so much just the straight skill demands.
We also try to use Dun & Bradstreet in order to gather, Dun & Bradstreet?
Dun & Bradstreet.
Yeah, in order to gather IT employer information, in order to administer a survey. And what we found was that IT companies are really, comes up quickly and just go away quickly. Mm. And Dun & Bradstreet, in my sense, does not really, might not reflect all those changes as quickly as it is happening. So I got a feeling that smaller IT companies might have been excluded.
Ironically, often the problem with Dun & Bradstreet is you get too many small little companies and they dominate your data set. Fortunately, in this case, because I'm looking at IT help desks, IT help desks are only located in larger establishments. Like a 4-person company does not have an IT help desk, on site. And so when I designed this for, say, computer systems design firms, which are that's the #1 employer of IT help desk, computer user support specialists. I limited it to companies with more than 50 employees. Because if an establishment has less than 50 employees, it's very unlikely that they're going to have an on-site IT help desk. Even still, part of the challenge of this was I drew a random sample, but then many establishments in the random sample don't have IT help desks. Even if it's a 400-person establishment, some 400-person establishments are connected to firms, and the IT help desk is in, 6 states over. It's not in that location. And so that's one reason we had to start with large samples using this random methodology. The benefit is you end up with something that's very representative, but you lose a ton of your sample by calling and being like, asking, do you have a IT help desk? And many people are like, no, we don't. And then, you can't use that observation. So you do, when you use Dun & Bradstreet to construct survey, you do have to think a lot about how to get the population you want. In this case, because I'm looking at all different industries, this lowest category is every different industry. I want kind of I want banks and insurance company, I want all these things. And Dun & Bradstreet does a great job with that. If you want kind of internet startups, I agree, there's going to be a lag. You're going to have a lot of measurement error because they, come into being, go out of being, they're small, they might show up in Dun & Bradstreet a couple years late, but for this study, that's not a problem because those entities don't have help desks. So, all right, well, thanks very much.